Thank you for coming to this special and I think quite extraordinary event. I'm Larry Diamond. I'm a senior fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. I'm also acting now as coordinator of our Israel program at the Freeman Spogli Institute. And in that capacity and as part of the larger community, I would like to welcome you to the 2024 Daniel Pearl Memorial Lecture. We are pleased to co-sponsor this lecture with Hillel at Stanford. Rabbi Jessica, are you here somewhere? Jessica Kirshner has been our partner in this, and if she's not here, I'm sure she'll be here soon. Of course, part of the purpose of this lecture is to celebrate the life and blessed memory of Daniel Pearl. Daniel, beloved son of Ruth and Judea Pearl, and beloved brother to his sisters, Tamara and Michelle, was born on October 10th, 1963 in New Jersey and grew up in California. He attended Stanford University in 1981 to 1985, and as I've told his father, Judea, and his family who are with us here, he was in the same class at Stanford University as the person who is now the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, Michael McFaul, who sends his regrets that he has... Sorry? Oh, you are here. You made it. Michael McFaul, thank you so much. I don't know what you did to transform your schedule, but I want to thank Ambassador McFaul for his support of the Israel program, for his support of this lecture. And for sharing in this effort to elevate the memory of his late classmate, Daniel Pearl. Danny, as he's called by his family and many of his friends, attended Stanford, as I said, class of '85, graduating Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in communications, before embarking on a brilliant career in journalism. In October 2000, he became the Wall Street Journal's South Asia bureau chief. He and his wife, Marianne, moved to India, where Daniel reported primarily on India and Pakistan. On February 1, 2002, shortly after the 9/11 attack on the United States, Daniel was kidnapped and brutally murdered by Islamist terrorists while on assignment in Karachi. 5 years later, in 2007, the al-Qaeda operative Khalid Sheikh Mohammed claimed responsibility for his murder. 3 weeks after the murder, the kidnappers released a horrific videotape, which I'm not going to describe in any detail, that showed the final moments of Daniel's life. Despite being coerced to read a statement, Daniel never disavowed his Jewish identity or his Jewish faith. For all those who knew him, and of course, most of all his family, Daniel Pearl was a man who dedicated his life to bringing joy and understanding to the world. His family has made sure that Daniel will be remembered for his love for life, not for the tragedy of his death, and of course, the principles of truth and free expression, which he stood for and which we hope to continue to advance with this lecture. Shortly after his murder, his parents, the late Ruth and the father, Judea, who is here with us now. There you are, thank you. Founded the Daniel Pearl Foundation. The foundation's mission is to promote cross-cultural understanding through journalism, music, and dialogue. At Stanford, the Pearl family established the Daniel Pearl Memorial Journalism Internship, awarded annually since 2003. It provides outstanding Stanford students an opportunity to intern in a foreign bureau of the Wall Street Journal. We are honored and humbled to have with us here, as I've said, Daniel's father, Judea, and I would like to now call on him to make some brief remarks.
It's a great pleasure and honor to be at Stanford again. It is a place full of memories for us. I want first to thank all the people responsible for this event, including the Hillel, Rabbi Jessica, and the Center for Israel Studies, and all the people that helped putting it together, and all the people that have helped in the past institute this memorial lecture, which has become a milestone, a cultural milestone in the Stanford community for introspection, assertion, and common values. It is full of nostalgic memories for us. It is on this ground that I remember Danny falling in love with the English language, falling in love with journalism, and attaining curiosity about the world outside the United States. It was from this grounds and this campus that he took off to travel the dusty roads of the Middle East and Northeast Africa with his laptop and his violin, and carrying two messages. One message was that it's time for America to see how the rest of the world lives and operates and think. And the second message was that man is not an enemy of another man, but a kindred spirit, a brother. So it is very touching for us to be back at Stanford and see the memorial lecture series, which is now renovated at your campus. And I would like to say a few words about our speaker, my friend and mentor, Yossi Klein Halevi, whom I met for maybe 20 or 22 years ago in Los Angeles. Who knows, when time passed. And he was one of the first to recognize the symbolic power of Danny's story and its potential for combining reach out and pride at the same time. Two elements that shine through Yossi Klein Halevi's work and make him uniquely qualified to present this memorial lecture. Like Danny, he is driven by the quest to understand the beauty of others and simultaneously, to assert and to amplify the beauty of thyself. Okay. Your tradition and your capacity to add a colorful stroke to the mosaic of humanity. I should also say that we found ourselves in the same trenches many years ago. Okay. I was doing a traveling dialogue with Pakistani Muslims, and Yossi was doing his dialogue with Palestinian friends. And occasionally we would call each other and say, have you seen a spark of acceptance? Because we both reach an impasse in all our dialogue. there was a curtain which we cannot cross, and this is the legitimization of Israel. Whenever you can talk with the Muslims about the beauty of Abraham and Ishmael and the unimportant differences between praying 3 times a day or 5 times a day, but whenever you got to the legitimization of Israel, a curtain fell and we felt there's no more progress. And Yossi recognized it early in the game. And he came out with a trademark that I think it is your trademark, Yossi, which is reconciliation second, legitimization first. It affected me in my work. I came with a similar slogan, equally indigenous, which Yossi endorsed. And once Yossi endorsed one of your slogans, you take it seriously. Okay. I would like just to end by saying, giving one secret for Yossi that you may not know, and this is that he is a musicologist in addition to being a journalist and a philosopher. Right? I heard him speak about in UCLA about the transformative movement that Israeli pop music went from singing we to singing me. Namely, the change of theme from collective to individual themes in Israeli music. So if you have a chance to invite him to another lecture, perhaps in music, don't miss this chance. Thank you, Yossi, very much for honoring our son with your lecture today.
Well, Judea, thank you for honoring us with your presence and the presence of your family. It's deeply meaningful to us. And of course, we welcome you as a fellow professor of computer science at UCLA, and someone who I know deeply shares the values of this program. Before I introduce our speaker, I also want to thank the other people who've helped to make this event possible. Most of all, my colleagues in the Israel program here at FSI, Amichai Magen, our visiting lecturer, and Kate Tominska, who's our program manager. I see some of the wonderful staff at FSI, Ari Chasnoff, who handles communication, Megan Gorman, our associate director, and anyone else, my assistant, Chelsea Soriano, and so many others. We deeply appreciate your support. Let me say, I'm going to say a little bit about Yossi, and first I'll say the formal, but I have to demand a word to say the informal before I ask him to join me on the stage. We share a lot. We're of a similar generation, Yossi and I. He was born in New York. He got a BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and an MS in journalism from Northwestern University. He met his future wife, Sarah, who is a Stanford alum, in a class of 79, I believe, in a writing program in New York. So we're so glad you have a Stanford connection. And he emigrated to Israel. He made Aliyah in his late 20s in 1982. He aspired to be and has become an extraordinary writer, I think, just purely in terms of the quality of his writing. To my mind, one of the best and most moving writers. And he has become an intellectual and analyst as well. He's a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He's a journalist. He's a commentator. And he's the author of several books about Israel and the Middle East and his own personal stunning journey. His 2001 book, At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, A Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land, was hailed by none other than the Archbishop of Canterbury as extraordinary and heartbreaking, a book full of wonders. His 2013 book, Like Dreamers, I love the biblical allusion, but I also like the title because I think of you, Yossi, as a dreamer. The subtitle is The Story of the Israeli Paratroopers Who Reunited Jerusalem and Divided a Nation, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. His latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, a New York Times bestseller, has been widely praised as one of the most unique and important books on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When I had students who wanted to do directed reading with me on the conflict, it was the first book that I had them read, which is why they produced the essays that you've seen. It's been described as a call not to arms, but to empathy, and the work of a gifted thinker. He's now working on a book on how the Jewish people went from the lowest point in their history in 1945 to one of the peak moments in Jewish history just before October 7th. And how did the Jewish people do this? And how can the Jews thrive in the 21st century? What could be a bigger subject? I want to say, finally, he's not just a gifted thinker. He really is, I think, a unique and extraordinary human being. I've said to him, I think he's the ultimate mensch. I have rarely, as we get older, I'm pretty old now, our social circles shrink. We don't make new friends so easily and so often. And in recent decades, I have never encountered a human being with whom I have felt such an instant and profound kinship of friendship, and I will say admiration, as the person who I am now going to invite onto the stage, Yossi Klein Halevi. So we'll put you in the center. So the way we're going to do this is that we're going to have a conversation for the next 40 minutes or so, 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll entertain your questions. Have we been able to distribute cards to people who want to post? So we'll ask you in about 20 minutes or so, about 4:45, to pass your cards toward the center of the room from whichever side you're in. If you're in the middle, let's just say you'll pass them to your right, which is my left, and then we'll have people collecting them. Then I'm going to ask our visiting scholar, Amichai Magien, to come to the stage. He'll be sorting through these questions, and we'll pose them. So Yossi, again, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you so much. Can you hear me? No, it's not on? It is on.
Okay, good.
So I really reciprocate the friendship and the admiration. And Yehuda, I have to tell you that it's never happened to me before that one of my mentors calls me a mentor. So I'm deeply, deeply honored to be here. I didn't have the pleasure or the privilege to know Danny, but through Yehuda, I feel that I do, and through his wonderful family. And so thank you. Thank you for this honor.
Thank you, Yossi. So it's not easy to begin with October 7th, but I think perhaps necessary to do so. The deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. We struggle to find words for this. Simply calling it a terrorist attack doesn't capture the scale of it. It was popular in the U.S., as you know, to call it Israel's 9/11. That doesn't really seem to hit the mark either. So how do you characterize this horrible assault on the state of Israel and the people of Israel?
I think you're right that we don't yet have a name for this. We don't have a name for October 7th. We don't have a name for the war. And I think that that expresses this sense of an Israeli society that has become unmoored since October 7th. And the truth is that we had already gone through what I would argue was the worst year in Israel's history before October 7th. This was the most divisive year. And there was really this sense of the beginning of a social disintegration, an assault on Israel's democratic institutions, and an existential threat to Israeli decency. And then October 7th presented us with a different model of Israel's disintegration coming from without, from an external threat. And what we experienced on that day was a kind of pre-enactment of what the destruction, the physical destruction of Israel would look like. It was a destruction of Israel in microcosm. The border was completely open. The army was nowhere to be seen. Civilians were left to their own devices. And so beyond the shock of the extent of the deaths, and everyone in Israel knows someone who was killed on October 7th, and beyond the horror, the ways in which people were murdered, is this sense that something fundamental in the Israeli ethos was destroyed on that day. And the sense that, first of all, the covenant that Israel made with its citizens, that we always believed that we would be protected. At the very least, we knew that the home front would not become the real front. And on October 7th, that was upended. But on a deeper level, October 7th was an existential challenge to the promise that Zionism made to the Jewish people around the world. We promised to create a safe refuge. And Israel today, as a result of October 7th, is by far the most dangerous country in the world to be a Jew, physically. And I'm emphasizing physically because this is my first time out of Israel since October 7th. And what I've learned in being away from home is that Israel is actually the safest place in the world to be a Jew psychologically. And every conversation that I've had since coming here is potentially fraught. A conversation with an Uber driver. Where are you from? Long pause. And you wait. And so that's something that I don't think we in Israel fully appreciate. You appreciate that once you step out of that safe space. But the fact that we have lost the credibility of the Zionist promise of safe refuge, and it's playing out in the most immediate way for Israeli citizens. We have tens of thousands of what we call internal refugees from the southern border, from the northern border. We no longer fully trust our own ability to protect ourselves. And that, for me, is what this war is about. And that's why I didn't hesitate to define this war from the beginning as existential. Existential not in the immediate sense. If we don't destroy the genocidal regime on our border, it doesn't mean that we are going to be in immediate existential danger. But if we don't restore the credibility of our ability to protect ourselves, and protecting ourselves now very much means undoing as much as possible the disastrous perception of victimhood that we experienced on October 7th. And victimhood is antithetical to the Israeli ethos. If we leave the Hamas regime on our border, we will be at the beginning of a long-term decline in Israel's perceived power. And in the Middle East, if Israel is perceived to be weak, that will become a reality. And you just need to look at our borders and see that Iran is on almost every border. It is Iran's historic victory to have moved its war with Israel on almost every one of our borders. And so I think for really most Israeli Jews, on October 8th, there was the realization that if we don't restore our military deterrence, that we are going to be in existential danger. And I think that that accounts for the extraordinary unanimity that we saw around this war. And what made it even more extraordinary was that we pivoted from the most divisive year in our history to one of the peak moments in Israeli unity, literally in one day. And it was something extraordinary to see. I've been in Israel now for 40 plus years, and the only time that I can compare it to is perhaps the period of the Second Intifada, the 4 years of suicide bombings in the early 2000s, when there was consensus on the need to militarily suppress the suicide bombings, but maybe even going back to the Yom Kippur War of 1973. I don't know if we've seen this level of support for a war since then, which includes virtually the whole of the Israeli left. And that's something that I think hasn't been internalized in much of the discourse, certainly in liberal and progressive conversation here in America. And so there really is this sense that this is a defining moment for Israel. And maybe I'll just say one last point about deterrence. About 15 years ago, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, famously compared Israel to a spider web. And he said that just as a spider web appears from outside to be impenetrable, but with a single swipe it disintegrates, that is the state of Israel. October 7th was the swipe of the spider web. We truly were a spider web on October 7th. And for that perception to stand in the Middle East is really an existential threat. And so for me, in some sense, this is the war against the perception of the spider web.
So let's talk about that war in two respects. Number one, if there's anything more you want to say in commentary on the frequently offered argument in the United States that this is Netanyahu's war, that he is prolonging this war to save his political life, and I'd say the majority of Americans and even American Jews, and I guess actually the majority of Israelis at this point, are not too fond of him, and so maybe that's enough of a reason to say stop. So first comment on that, and then I want to get to the objectives underlying Israel's military campaign in Gaza.
To say that a majority of Israelis are not too fond of Netanyahu is a beautiful example of understatement. And there is virtually nothing that I would put past Netanyahu today. Would he prolong the war if he could, if it meant an advantage politically to his position? I have no doubt that he would. I don't think the Netanyahu of 10 years ago would have done that. He has become, I believe, the sum total of his worst qualities. And in the past, he was a much more complex figure, more pragmatic. And in any case, the perception that this is Netanyahu's war is faulty in two ways. First of all, it, it, it ignores the virtual consensus within Jewish Israel, and I'm making a distinction between Jewish Israel and the Arab Israeli minority, that remains certainly around the moral justification of this war. Now, there are lots of demonstrations in Israel today. We're back to mass demonstrations against the government, but no one is demonstrating against the war. And I think that that's not clearly understood abroad. The demonstrations that happen on a weekly, sometimes a daily basis, against the government, either on behalf of the hostages or to demand new elections, are not about the legitimacy of this war, which I find really extraordinary, because this is Israel's ugliest and most brutal war, and yet we, and I certainly include myself there, it's not even a majority, it's virtual consensus within Jewish Israel that this is a just and essential war. So it's not Netanyahu's war, it's my war. It's the war of the people of Israel. Say about this war what you will, but the criticism is directed toward us. And the second, more, I'd say, technical point that is not sufficiently understood abroad is that Netanyahu is not really the commander-in-chief in times of war. He's the first among equals. And it isn't even this terrible cabinet of ultras, ultra-nationalists, ultra-Orthodox, ultra-corrupt, the coalition of the ultras. It isn't even the cabinet that is deciding this war. It is a small group, a half a dozen ministers, who form the war cabinet. And out of those ministers, I reasonably trust the strategic, political, and moral instincts of 5 out of the 6. The 6th happens to be the prime minister. But the other 5, Gallant, the defense minister, Benny Gantz, Eisenkot, 2 former IDF commanders-in-chief who were heads of the opposition until they joined the war cabinet. These are credible figures. And Netanyahu is constrained. He cannot do what perhaps he would want to do. And so it's not his war. He wishes it was. The one area where I think he has had a decisive influence, and to my mind a very destructive influence, is on the question of the hostage negotiations. He does have a much greater say on the negotiations than the other members of the war cabinet. And Netanyahu is being widely accused today, especially by the families of the hostages, of essentially sentencing them to death, of not prioritizing their release. And I'm increasingly sympathetic to that claim. It is an almost unthinkable accusation to make against the prime minister of the Jewish state, that he would willfully abandon 130 or however many are left, fellow Israelis. This is a country that sent commandos halfway across Africa in 1976 to rescue 100 hostages, fellow Israelis, in Entebbe. A raid that happened to have been led by Netanyahu's brother. And so the contrast of one Netanyahu to the other couldn't be more stark. And this actually, going back, Larry, to your first question about what was so profoundly disorienting about October 7th, is that we couldn't save 1,200 fellow Israelis within the sovereign borders of the state of Israel, to say nothing of the hostages who are within arm's reach of the IDF. We're there. They're within reach, and we couldn't save our fellow citizens on October 7th, and we couldn't save the hostages. And this, too, is a kind of existential challenge to what we always took for granted as an essential part of what it means to be an Israeli. We take care of each other. We didn't take care of each other on October 7th, and we're not taking care of the hostages.
Okay, before we go on, I want to make 2 points. One is, if you have written a card with a question on it, I'd like you here to pass it to this side, here to pass it to this side, and here to pass it to the center. And Natalie and Kate will go around. Amichai is going to spend some minutes reading those and trying to group them and organize them. And at 5 o'clock or so, I'll ask him to come up and join us and offer them. The second thing I want to say is, anytime you have an opportunity to hear this man, I urge you to take it, because there's always, even if he's saying some similar things, a nuance and an angle and another dimension of eloquence. So I will say that some of my questions, as you know, are inspired by the recent podcast you had with Dan Senor, where you were joined by a very prominent American Jewish rabbi in New York. I think it's an extraordinary conversation. And I was struck by one of the things you said in that podcast. You said, being powerful brings responsibility. Now, you said it in a way that I think may not be the way that is intuitive to a lot of Americans. And I suspect that you have multiple dimensions of understanding of the word responsibility. But I'd like you to expand on what you meant by that, and then I'd like to kind of bring it back to the war in Gaza.
So to take a step back from this moment, a big step back, in 1945, the Jewish people made a decision to go for power, that powerlessness had become untenable, literally untenable. And the pre-Holocaust debate over Zionism that had really divided the Jewish people very deeply ended in 1945. And the decision to go for power, I think, was one of the greatest moments in Jewish history, one of the greatest success stories, the story that too many Jews take for granted today. But that transition, almost from a historic perspective, almost an abrupt transition from the lowest point in our history to really one of the peak moments. I celebrate our return to power. I celebrate our ability to defend ourselves. And I'll say something even more provocative. I celebrate our ability to immediately transition from October 7th to October 8th. And so, but that assumption of power has responsibilities. And to my mind, it has two responsibilities. The first, the most obvious, is that we have a responsibility to critique ourselves, especially when we are fighting a war like this, a war where combatants and civilians are so entwined. And it's disturbing to me that the discourse in Israel often seems to be as if we're only fighting Hamas, that the only people in Gaza are Hamas. And it's the reverse of what much of the discourse is here, where it often seems that there are only civilians in Gaza. And where's Hamas? And we see that in the deceptive number 30,000. 30,000, and everybody repeats it. 30,000. Israel has killed 30,000 Palestinians. And who are these 30,000? Israel says that we've killed between 13 and 14,000 terrorists. Now, that changes substantially the proportion between civilian and combatants. But that's a tangent to your question. I just can't help myself. And the other responsibility of power, and this has become more complicated since October 7th, and that is the responsibility to own being powerful. And if you have power, if you have the kind of power that we are wielding, and we are able to do to Gaza what we've done the last 6 months, you have no right to the identity of victim. First of all, we rejected the identity of victim in 1945. The identity of victim became the antithesis of the Israeli ethos. And I would also say when I look at the two flags on the bima of most American synagogues, what those two flags represent is that ethos of democracy, sovereignty, and also power. American Jewry and Israel together nurtured Jewish power as a response to the Holocaust. And what happened on October 7th, understandably, was a momentary relapse into the condition of powerlessness, into the condition of victimhood. It lasted all of one day, because the next day, Israeli society resolved not to allow that perception to stand. But there is no neat compartmentalization. What we experience emotionally and psychologically, what we go through. And for many Jews, including many Israelis, October 7th remains an experience of powerlessness, of victimhood. And many Israelis to this day speak of October 7th as a return to Jewish history. It's a very complicated term, because what Israelis mean by a return to Jewish history is really a return to pre-sovereignty, to the state of powerlessness. But we haven't returned to that state. And we find ourselves in this pathological loop between, on the one hand, feeling like victims, and on the other hand, being regarded by much of the world as victimizers. And neither category, neither victim nor victimizer, is adequate to explain Israel today. In terms of being victimizer, I believe deeply that Israel is acting as any country would in our place, at the very least. And in terms of being victim, it's an identity we rejected as a post-Holocaust people, and it is not an identity that we should seek. And I understand that's very complicated in a campus conversation. But I will say that I've been very uncomfortable when some American Jews have sought to insert Jews into the intersectionality hierarchy. I don't believe we belong there. And we don't belong there because the post-Holocaust story of the Jewish people is, if anything, more important than the Holocaust itself. And I say that as the son of a survivor. The way in which we survived is actually the more important long-term story of the Holocaust than the Holocaust itself. And so that is what we need to reaffirm today, because that's what's under threat. It's under threat from without, but it's also under threat from within by this relapse into the mindset of victimhood.
So I hope this will be the last editorial comment I make from this platform, but I want to say that an important element of my motive for bringing Yossi to this campus was the deep impact that his book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor,
Got it right first.
made on me. And I will just say, if you have not read it and you ever listen to audiobooks, I urge you to read the book that way, because he narrates it. And there's something special and deeply further emotionally moving about hearing his voice as he works through Jewish history and the effort to establish a connection with your Palestinian neighbor as you look out over the horizon and imagine who that might be. And in that book, Yossi, you yield nothing in your case for the state of Israel, in your pride as you've expressed it, for what it has accomplished, but to a degree that I think probably many people, I'm sure many Palestinians, would find surprising, particularly, if I may say so, for an Israeli who is not of the left. You express a word that, a concept that I think is not too common in this sphere, not too common, if I may say so, on this campus, and that is empathy. And I would like to ask you, what has happened to empathy? What has happened to the aspiration and the effort to achieve this connection between Israelis and Palestinians, to your effort to build these connections?
For me personally.
For you personally, after October 7th?
In my Israeli instincts, I'm very mainstream. Really very much of an ordinary Israeli who worries about security, who places security before any other consideration. And the shock and the aftershock of October 7th created I froze. I simply froze. And I would not be able to write that book today. I'm very glad that I wrote it. I'm glad that the book is out there. I don't repudiate anything that I wrote in there. But if we're speaking about the ability to empathize, and I'm not speaking about empathizing with Palestinian suffering, because that I hope is still part of my human makeup. But what I tried to do in that book was empathize with the Palestinian narrative, which is the counter-narrative to my story, and to try to see the Palestinian narrative not in the way that I always saw it, which is as a threat to my story, but as a parallel narrative that we're going to have to live with. And just as they're going to have to live with the Zionist narrative, because these are both powerful stories, and neither story is going away, just as neither people is going away. And that was the premise for writing this book. And I immersed myself in the Palestinian narrative. I read, I listened, and tried to write from that place of empathy for a people that was simultaneously created by the Jewish return home. The Palestinian national identity was created not only in response to our return home, but largely, and at the same time was shattered by our return home. The fact that one part of the Palestinian people is under occupation, another part are uneasy citizens in a Jewish state, a third part are in refugee camps in the Arab world, a fourth part is dispersed throughout the world. There are levels of shattering to this people that was not the intention of Zionism, despite what some historians claim. It was not the intention of the Jewish return home, but it was a consequence. I would argue it was a consequence of the Arab world's attempt to thwart the Jewish return home. Nevertheless, that was a result. And so I tried to speak to my Palestinian neighbor from a place of respect for their identity. And the truth is that I began that journey of encountering, engaging with Palestinian nationalism as a soldier. During the first Intifada of the late 1980s, early 90s, I was serving in the Gaza refugee camps. And this was what is called the Intifada of Stones. And in retrospect, it was more of a police operation than actually, we were more policemen than soldiers. But Palestinians would throw rocks at us. We were well armed. And that was the beginning of this kind of grudging respect that I felt for Palestinians as an adversary. It's a worthy adversary. And so the book was really a an attempt to conceptualize that respect that I felt, that I began to feel for them in those years. At the same time, I have no respect for the Palestinian national movement as a credible partner for peace. I can't think of another national movement that has more consistently rejected offers of statehood than the Palestinian national movement. And so I'm not an admirer of Palestinian leadership or of their national expression, but I do appreciate and respect Palestinian national identity. After October 7th, when I say that I froze, it was my capacity to respect their national counterclaim. And I can't do it now. And I hope that I'll be able to own my book and the place from which that book was written after this war. But at this point, I'm mobilized. I'm in a war. I'm in a war that I define as a war of long-term survival against an enemy that is capable, as we saw on October 7th, of absolutely anything and everything. So that's where I am now. And I've been involved very much in Muslim-Jewish dialogue at different levels, Palestinian-Israeli dialogue, religious dialogue between Jews and Muslims. And most of those efforts are now in suspension. I hope that they're not over, but certainly in suspension, because as soon as you bring in the question of genocide, it's impossible to have a civil conversation, even a civil disagreement. If you are accusing me of genocide, effectively saying that I am a Nazi, then you are creating a lynch mob against me. Now, Israel in this war may not have taken every precaution it should have to defend innocent life. And I have my questions about that. But I certainly can say without equivocation that the IDF does not target innocents. I know that as a soldier. I know it as the father of a soldier. We know the IDF. We don't do that. In this war, was the IDF as careful as it should be? I don't think so. But if you're accusing me of deliberately murdering civilians, there's no conversation left between us. And conversely, if you believe that that is what I'm doing, if you believe I am committing genocide, and I support that policy, then what possible interest can you have in dialogue with me? So genocide has upended whatever Muslim-Jewish conversation we had, Palestinian, Israeli, or more broadly, Muslim-Jewish. And how we recover that is really, for me, a major question, because I've devoted, along with you, Yehuda, so much of my life in the hope of a breakthrough in Muslim-Jewish conversation and in renewing the medieval civilizational encounter between the Jewish people and Islam. That was the hope that many of us who were involved in this effort had. And now there's a big question mark over that.
Well, I'm going to ask you one more question that is probably painful and unfair, and a long list of them, before I ask Amichai to come join us. And I'm certain that it is a question that is repeated among the number that he has in his notes there. I know that despite what you're saying, you also do look over the horizon, still now. And in the context of war, it's very hard to do. There's nothing more polarizing than war, nothing more emotional than war. And of course, we're very distant from it, but we've felt it on college campuses across the United States. This war is going to end at some point, and then the question is going to emerge again. One state, two states, occupation, you know, what is the future of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, and what is the future of that conundrum that is often referred to, that Israel cannot be a Jewish state, a democracy, and a permanently occupying state, Greater Israel. What are your thoughts on the longer term?
So I've long believed that a Palestinian state is simultaneously an existential necessity for Israel, that the occupation is a long-term existential threat, but that a Palestinian state is also potentially an existential threat. Existential necessity and existential threat. It's a very Israeli dilemma. Maybe it's a Jewish dilemma. And October 7th has, it seems to me, has really intensified both of those arguments. Because on the one hand, ask almost any Israeli Jew today, what do you think of a Palestinian state? And they'll tell you, are you out of your mind? I spoke to a friend of mine who was one of the founders of the Peace Now movement and devoted much of his life to convincing Israelis of a two-state solution. And I asked him, where are you today? He says, we can't do it. I said, you? You're saying, Avital, you? And so the overwhelming consensus for now, and I really emphasize for now, and this is in part an emotional response to October 7th, is we can't risk duplicating Gaza in the West Bank, which is our most sensitive border. The West Bank border is Greater Tel Aviv. 70% of the Israeli population lives under the West Bank highlands. And so the notion of speaking of a two-state solution in Israeli political discourse today, you will not go very far. But the opposite argument, which is that a Palestinian state is an existential necessity, I believe was also proved by October 7th. Because what October 7th proved was that Ariel Sharon was right when he pulled us out of Gaza, when he dismantled the settlements that he himself had built 20 or 30 years earlier. Because what Sharon understood and what October 7th really emphasized was that these two peoples cannot live together in one political entity. Whether it's the Jews who will be in control or the Palestinians, it will be a recipe for permanent civil war of the worst kind. And if we can't live together, then the only logical solution is separation. And so the far right in Israel will say, well, yeah, so we have to expel the Palestinians. And that's the politics of fantasy that is very tempting for some Israelis, but it would lead us in its own way to a fatal isolation, to say nothing of what it would do to our own moral credibility as a Jewish state. So I don't see an alternative in the long term to a two-state solution, and I'm terrified of a two-state solution. I share the right's arguments and warnings about a two-state solution, but the only outcome that seems to me more terrifying is a one-state. And sometimes the competition between those two fears, it's very small. The margin is very small. But I do fear the absence of a two-state in the long term more than I fear the two-state solution. So how do we get there? I don't believe that there's any chance any longer for a bilateral Palestinian-Israeli negotiating process. We know everything about each other's positions. There are no surprises anymore. But this has never been a Palestinian-Israeli conflict alone. This was always a regional conflict. For many years, it was the Sunni-Israeli conflict, and now increasingly, it's the Shiite-Israeli conflict, especially since the Abraham Accords. We're now
With Iran standing at the epicenter of that.
with Iran and its allies and proxies. Hamas is the only part of the Iranian axis that is Sunni. But Hamas has gone through some very interesting theological transformations in the last few years in trying to align itself with a strain of apocalyptic Shiism. And so what we're experiencing in Israel is that, well, first of all, this is something that's gone almost completely unstated. This is the first time that Israel is at war with Hamas, and we've been at war with Hamas periodically since 2008. That was the first Hamas-Israel mini-war. This is the first time that all the Arab countries that have diplomatic relations with Israel have kept their ambassadors in Israel. Now that's extraordinary. The worst, the most brutal war possible, and they're all still sitting in Israel. And we tend to take that for granted, but for me that's one of the most significant parts of this moment, and one of the most hopeful. Because what it says is that there may be, and I really want to be cautious, there may be a possibility for a regional approach to the Palestinian issue. And that can happen, I think, only if the Saudis come in to the process. And the Saudis have signaled to us very, very clearly, quietly but clearly, that they remain committed to normalization. Now, what the Saudis are asking us in return, and this is also extraordinary, in 2002 they released the Saudi plan, which presented a vision of normalization with the Arab world, provided that Israel withdrew to the 1967 lines, created a Palestinian state, and made some provision for readmitting the descendants of Palestinian refugees. It was not an offer for negotiation, it was a diktat. It was a take it or leave it plan, and no Israeli government could have accepted that. Today, all the Saudis are asking of us is to reaffirm our commitment to a long-term two-state solution, which was the policy of every government, starting with the Ehud Barak government in 1999 until this Netanyahu government. Every previous Netanyahu government, however many there were, 5, 20, and every government between 1999 and 2023 accepted the premise of a two-state solution. Whether they paid lip service to it or meant it, that was the official policy. And all the Saudis are asking of us today is reaffirm that the policy remains as a vision, a two-state solution. And this terrible government, and by terrible, I mean terrible for Israel's most basic interests, this terrible government can't even pay lip service to the idea of a two-state solution because of its far-right components, because Netanyahu has made himself a prisoner of the far right. So, God willing, this government will fall, and the next government will be able to reaffirm the long-term vision of a two-state solution. Once we have the Saudis on board, we can begin to realistically look at ways in which Israel's Arab allies, and think about that phrase for a moment. I can't say it without pausing, as someone who grew up believing that the Arab world is immutably opposed to Israel's existence. Israel now has Arab allies engaged in a process of normalization. So what that means to me is that we have allies with whom we have a shared interest in controlling a Palestinian state so that it doesn't become a radical outpost of Iran, for example. And if you bring the Saudis in, you bring the Gulf states in, you're also bringing in economic support. So it's possible for the first time to imagine a regional solution, to go back to the Saudi plan of 2002, but in a whole new way, in a way that respects Israel as a partner and doesn't seek to defeat Israel. It's not using a peace process to bring Israel to its knees. So I think that if this wasn't such a catastrophic moment, it would actually be possible to be optimistic.
Well, while I'm inviting Amichai to come up to the podium and join us, I'll just quote my grandmother in saying, "From your mouth to God's ears," and our friends in the Arab world that we know in saying, "Inshallah." So, Amichai, I've had the easy task. Now you have the impossible task.
Yeah, you know, the most unpopular person in Israel, not to get too personal, traditionally is not the prime minister, but it's the minister of finance. You know, he's the one who has to say no to a lot of requests, and he's the one who stands between you and the buffet outside. And so I'm playing the role of Minister of Finance today. That's what I got in the coalition government arrangement that with Professor Diamond and with more questions. I'm going to have to say no to these as well. No, but what I did is to read 95% of the questions that we've received and then put them together into thematic clusters. I can tell you that there are a lot of doctors in the room because many of the handwritten notes are completely indecipherable. But the ones that I could read, I put together. And so I'm going to share those with you, Yossi and Larry, and let's see how we do time-wise. So the question or the theme that arose most often from the notes that I was able to decipher had to do with public diplomacy and this profound frustration that many people feel that there is this indescribable gap between what we know Israel is as a society and as a state and how it is portrayed in the mainstream media, social media, that incredibly frustrating and painful gap. But it raises a question about legitimacy, and there were questions about what can Israel do to improve its public relations. There was also a question in relation to the United Nations in particular. Does the United Nations play any role still in 2024 in providing or denying Israel legitimacy? So perhaps we could start with that.
So there are a few components, I think, to this question. The first is, why are we losing the war for hearts and minds? In the age of social media, and there are many, many more reasons in this, but one reason that I think is obvious is that in the age of social media, the side that has the fewest and most compelling words wins. The Palestinian side has a winning vocabulary. You've got 4 or 5 words: ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid. What have I left out? Genocide. Now it's genocide. On our side, well, in 1947, we accepted partition, and they didn't. And actually, in 1937, with the Peel Commission, we also accepted, you're finished. You start talking about the Peel Commission, and it's over. And so the Jewish story is a complicated story. We have a long story to tell. It's thousands of years. And Zionism is a complicated story. And you can't tell it the way that the anti-Zionist camp can tell their story. So we're at an immediate disadvantage, which I see in the long term as an advantage, because we have a story that's very rich. We just need to re-own that story. And even though it's complicated, and even though it's the age of social media, I believe in the power of a good story. The other reason, and Amichai, you touched on this in your class today, I think it was in your class. We've been together for so many events.
Several classes.
It's hard to remember in the last 2 days. But the ground has been laid for the delegitimization of Israel for decades. And we were asleep, or we didn't take it seriously enough. Every aspect of the Jewish people's return home has been deconstructed and delegitimized. So the founding of Zionism was not a powerless people seeking to re-indigenize itself in its land. It was a 19th century European colonialist movement. The founding of the state in 1948 was not this extraordinary moment of human achievement, one of the great moments in human history, where a broken people reestablishes its national sovereignty, but it is reduced to Nakba. That's what 1948 now is in the popular imagination. And I got that, by the way, yesterday. I was in an Uber, and after the long pause of where you're from, the driver asked me, so what about the Nakba? She was from Australia. She said, what about the Nakba? And she used the word Nakba. And at first I was impressed that, she knows, and then I got profoundly depressed, because you realize that what the founding of Israel today, in many people's minds, is simply ethnic cleansing, without any of the context, without the war that was declared against Israel, without the ethnic cleansing that Arab armies did against the Jews in Israel anywhere they reached, and of course without the expulsion of nearly 1 million Jews from Arab countries. So Nakba is 1948. 1967 and its aftermath is apartheid. And now we've reached the last station in this process of delegitimization, which is genocide. There's nowhere to go past genocide. Once you're a genocidal state, you have lost your final shred of legitimacy. So what we're experiencing now, undoing this moment, is not it's not a matter of public relations, because the perceptions have accumulated. There's a whole worldview of history now, of our story, that has been poisoned, turned against itself. Even the Holocaust, and I would put it more strongly, especially the Holocaust, is now being used against us as well. And we saw it at the Oscars. How can the Jews the Jews are manipulating the Holocaust. It's legitimate for the enemies of Israel to invoke the Holocaust. It's illegitimate for the defenders of Israel to invoke the Holocaust. And so the entire modern Jewish story from the 1940s onward has been dismantled. And that's what we have to face. So this is so much deeper than this moment. And this is something that, and Yehuda for years has been writing about that, how the war against Israel's legitimacy is actually worse than anti-Semitism. And here I agree, certainly as an Israeli. For me, anti-Zionism doesn't have to literally be anti-Semitism to be the greatest threat that the Jewish people faces. It is the attempt to restore us to the condition of powerlessness. There's no greater threat than anti-Zionism. And so whether it is technically anti-Semitic or not, and I believe a case can be made that it's anti-Semitic, but Yehuda's argument is that that's almost beside the point. The great threat to Jewish well-being in our generation is coming from anti-Zionism. And that's where we have to develop sophisticated tools to begin addressing a process that goes back at least 40 years.
Yossi, one of the clusters of questions that we received has to do with the framing of the conflict. You touched upon this a little bit in making the astute and important and now clearer observation that this conflict is not an Israel-Gaza conflict. Gaza is one arena active arena among 6 or 7 active arenas that are controlled and directed and funded and armed by Iran. So we had a number of questions about Iran, and when I summarized them, it really has to do with this question: what do we do about Iran? Can Israel face Iran alone, particularly if Iran crosses the military nuclear threshold and becomes a nuclear-armed theocratic power set on domination of the Middle East and set on the annihilation of Israel? Can Israel face Iran alone, or does it absolutely need the United States with it in order to face the Iranian threat?
I don't know. I don't know our capabilities. I've heard conflicting assessments, but I feel very deeply, as I felt for many years, that Israel cannot allow Iran to go nuclear. And that means that sooner or later, and I imagine sooner, especially after this last week, that we will be in direct confrontation with Iran. Whether we can fight Iran alone, whether the Biden administration will let us fight Iran alone, I don't know. I don't know what we can do. I don't know what the administration will do. But I do believe very deeply that if we allow Iran to go nuclear, then October 7th really will be the beginning of a downward trajectory. And first of all, Israelis will lose faith in our ability to defend ourselves if we have said, as we have, since the Rabin era. Rabin was the first Israeli leader to define a nuclear Iran as an existential threat. In fact, and this tends to be forgotten, Rabin initiated the Oslo process with the Palestinians because he wanted to neutralize what he called the inner circle of threat, which are the Palestinians, Syria, and Lebanon, to deal with what he called the outer circle of threat, which was Iran. And he defined a nuclear Iran as the only real existential threat that Israel faced. And Rabin went further and bought the first fleet of long-term jets for the Israeli Air Force, and they were known in the Israeli Air Force as the Tehran fleet. And so Rabin is really the father. It wasn't Netanyahu. And I give Netanyahu credit for carrying the fight against Iran, but that was really initiated by Rabin. And this is the moment that Rabin foresaw. And so to acquiesce with a regime that is committed to our destruction, a regime that is a Holocaust denier, that has encircled Israel with genocidal entities, to allow Iran to go nuclear, to my mind, is a betrayal of Zionism.
We had a number of questions pertaining to U.S.-Israel relations specifically, and your views on how the Biden administration interpreted October 7th, reacted to October 7th, both in the immediate aftermath, but also over the last few months, and whether you are concerned that the commitment of the Biden administration to Israel's security is wavering as we enter election season in the United States.
What we experienced from the administration and from Biden in particular in the aftermath of October 7th was an extraordinary embrace, not a bear hug. Now it's resembling a bit more of a bear hug, but it was a genuine embrace. When Biden came to Israel and spoke to the Israeli public, what you read on Israeli social media over and over again was, we finally have a prime minister. And that was the feeling. that he was speaking to us the way that an Israeli leader after October 7th should have spoken to the public. And it wasn't just words. It was backed up, as it was just again today, when the U.S. Vetoed the Security Council resolution recognizing or admitting a Palestinian state into the UN, which Israelis rightly perceive, I believe, as an intolerable reward for October 7th. The administration has made all of the right decisions. It's done all of the right things. It hasn't always said the right things. And that's increasingly problematic because I believe that saying the wrong things, for example, when Biden called on Israel to unilaterally declare a ceasefire, you don't do that when you're in the middle of hostage negotiations with Hamas. You reinforce Hamas that way. And I'll add, by the way, for the same reason, I agree with Netanyahu, and it pains me to say those words, but I agree with him that the demonstrations by the hostage families also reinforces Hamas. It hardens Hamas. I understand why the hostages feel the need to cry out, precisely because they believe that Netanyahu has abandoned their families. And I think if we had a different prime minister, the hostages would not be protesting in this way. But we have to be careful about what we say, because it's a very delicate moment. And so the administration hasn't always been as careful in its language. But yes, we're coming into a very difficult election period. And I think a compelling argument can be made that preventing the election of the guy who is running against Biden is really a life and death issue for much of the world. And I don't believe that Trump is going to be anywhere near as supportive of Israel in the second term as he was in his first. So I think that this is probably as good as it gets, an old-fashioned pro-Israel Democrat who's also an interventionist. And again, we're allowed to have differences of opinion, and we're allowed to, both sides are allowed to critique the other. But the basis of our relationship with this administration, I think, is solid.
In conclusion, Yossi, the founding prime minister of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, famously said that in Israel, if you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist. And we are interested and intrigued by your vision of hope.
Oh, I thought I was being hopeful throughout this talk.
Those were the good news, you say, huh?
You know, Amichai, I once spoke to a...
No, but let me just conclude the question.
I want to just respond to that for a moment.
Yes, if you
about
don't
optimism.
believe about optimism.
That I once spoke to a board of American Jews and Israelis, both on the same board. And when I finished speaking, the Israeli said, you're so naive. And the Americans said, pass the Prozac. You know, so it's you know.
It's a matter of perspective.
Right.
Okay. But leave us on, and I know you have a vision of hope. You're a writer of hope, and you're a man of vision and of deep conviction and hope. Where does Israel go from here? What's the right thing for us to do, domestically, regionally, internationally? If you were advising this or that prime minister or this or that president, give us a sense of a strategic direction that you would want to see Israel take.
So first of all, in terms of hope, what astonishes me to this day is how Israeli society pivoted from October 6th to October 8th. Again, what I said earlier, we went from the most divisive time in our history to one of our most cohesive. And what was even more extraordinary about October 8th was that Israeli society mobilized itself. The government disintegrated on October 8th. Social services fell apart. It was the protest movement, ironically, which filled the void. Something like 50% of Israelis participated in some form of voluntarism after October 7th. And for me, this was the moment of the maturation of Israeli society, because this is the first time that Israelis went to war with no trust in their government. Look, we always doubt the wisdom of our leaders during war. It goes back to Levi Eshkol before the Six-Day War, Golda Meir, of course, in Yom Kippur, Menachem Begin in the First Lebanon War, Ehud Olmert in the Second. But we always trusted the basic decency and integrity of our leaders. This is the first war where a strong majority of Israelis believe, and this is according to polls, that the prime minister places his own personal interests ahead of the interests of the country. No one doubted that Golda placed the interests of the country before her own interests. That's not the case now. I don't believe that an earlier, less mature Israel could have gone to war with a Netanyahu as prime minister. And so this is the moment when Israelis assumed full responsibility for ourselves. We mobilized ourselves. And it began the year before, when you had, for the first time in Israel's history, the emergence of a mass movement taking responsibility for the civic institutions of the country and for the identity of the country. We've had mass protest movements for political issues. This is the first time that we had a mass movement dealing with the essence of Israel. What is a Jewish and democratic state? So we are in an extraordinary turning point in Israeli history, and I'm optimistic about the future of Israel. That's not to sweep under the rug the deep differences that have not gone away, the fact that this government is still governing. Every day I wake up and I feel personally tormented by that. And it's a personal affront. And I feel that Netanyahu is tormenting me. And I dream about him. I've had dreams about Netanyahu. I had a dream that he bit me. And to this day, I feel it viscerally. I feel he really did. And so I'm not ignoring those the formidable threats that we're facing internally. But I feel that we are a transformed society than we were before October 7th. And so that, first of all, that gives me hope. In terms of what I would say to a prime minister who I would want to say anything to, strategically, I'm wondering whether we should now cut a deal, even a bad deal with Hamas, get whatever hostages we can still retrieve, end this stage of the war in Gaza, but as part of a package agreement with the United States and maybe some of our other allies, and we still have a few, to accept the widening of this war, to accept that this is not a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, this is an Iranian-Israeli conflict, and to have a long-term strategy. It doesn't have to be next month, but we do need an immediate strategy for dealing with a nuclear Iran. I would end the war in Gaza for a serious commitment to stop Iran, whatever that means. And as far as renewing a regional negotiating process to again, this is on the assumption that we now have a new government that comes in, to place the 2024 version of the Saudi plan at front and center of the West's involvement with the Middle East, and to go for a long-term, and I emphasize that, a long-term process that shifts us from moving toward annexation and settlement expansion toward a very gradual testing of the possibility, I'm really trying to be cautious here, of an eventual two-state arrangement. Not a peace, not a grand peace vision. But you can't talk about peace in Israel today after October 7th. But you can talk about an arrangement, moving us in a different direction. And that's what I would like to see.
Yossi, the last 6 months, I think certainly for all Israelis and many, many people around the world have been unprecedented, an unprecedented mixture of difficult feelings and difficult emotions of sadness and incredulity and rage and shame and grief and disorientation. And I just want to say on a personal note that it is at times of disorientation that we look for individuals who will guide us, who will not sweet talk us into a false reality, but who will help us confront difficult realities and grapple with them, who would be moral guides and moral compasses. And I think I speak for all of us when I say that you are one of really a handful of individuals in the world who perform the role of that moral guide and who provide us with orientation. So thank you deeply for this amazing conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. I have, before you stand up, I just have one announcement to make. Maybe it's another ray of hope in this room at this time, 11 days from now, on Monday, the 29th of April, we will host the former Palestinian Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad, in conversation. Amichai is hosted by the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law here within FSI. Catherine Stoner, director, was with us. I don't know if she's still here. And we have a program on Arab reform and democracy there. That program will sponsor this coming event. So we invite you to that as well. And my point of hope is that much of what you said at the end, I think I'd say is consistent with an incremental and piecemeal vision of Palestinian state building that after all this time later, since he left the office, Salam Fayyad is still articulating. I want to echo what Amichai said. I want to echo what you were beginning to express. Just profound thanks for this enormously eloquent and inspiring writer, thinker, and friend. Thank you, Yossi.